Welcome to our deep dive. You ready to explore the origins of the U.S. Constitution?
Absolutely. I'm excited to dig into this period. It's a really pivotal moment that set the stage for the America we know today.
We've gotten a lot of requests from listeners who want to understand this era better.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? From the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, and then those early political parties.
So much happened in such a short time. It's a period packed with drama, compromise, and those big personalities that we all find so interesting.
You're telling me it's like a political thriller, but it really happened.
Speaking of drama, we have to start with this quote from Benjamin Franklin. At the Constitutional Convention, he said, "Thus, I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors, I sacrifice to the public good."
Wow, that quote really captures the weight of the decisions they were facing, right? Like they knew the stakes were incredibly high.
It wasn't just a philosophical exercise. This was about the survival of the nation.
Exactly. The newly formed country was struggling under the Articles of Confederation. Things were pretty dire.
Let's paint a picture for our listeners. What was the state of the nation at that time?
Okay, imagine a country unable to enforce treaties, drowning in war debts. It couldn't repay, constantly on the brink of conflict with major powers, like Britain.
Doesn't sound like a recipe for success.
It wasn't. Internally, things weren't much better either. The central government was so weak it couldn't even tax, which
There's
meant...
no money to run the government.
Right, and a worthless national currency. An economic depression that crippled the nation-states were at each other's throats, imposing trade barriers. It was chaos.
It's understandable why Franklin and the others felt they needed to take drastic action.
The Annapolis Convention in 1786 tried to address some of these issues, but it was a flop. Not enough support.
So the Constitutional Convention was like an emergency intervention. The nation was on the verge of collapse.
Exactly. They needed a bold solution, and fast.
So in the summer of 1787, you have these 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia representing different states, backgrounds, generations. How did they even begin to work together with all those differences?
It's remarkable, isn't it? Despite their differences, they were united by a common fear. The fear of failure.
Failure of the American experiment.
Right. They knew the world was watching, waiting to see if a government by the people could actually work.
And they chose to do all of this in secret. Why the secrecy?
Well, imagine trying to create a new government with every debate, every disagreement splashed across the newspapers.
It would be chaos.
Total chaos. Secrecy allowed for honest debate and compromise. They needed a space free from public pressure where they could really hash things out.
It's fascinating to think about what went on behind those closed doors. We know some of the key players: James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, John Dickinson. But those debates are shrouded in mystery.
We get glimpses through letters and personal accounts, but much of it is still unknown, which makes it even more intriguing.
And those compromises were key to the Constitution's creation.
Absolutely. Without compromise, there would be no Constitution.
Let's dive into some of the major issues they tackled. Representation was a big one, right?
Huge. The large states like Virginia wanted representation based on population, more people, more power. This was the Virginia Plan.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Right. But the smaller states like New Jersey, they were terrified of being overshadowed. They pushed for equal representation for each state regardless of size. The New Jersey Plan.
Sounds like a recipe for gridlock. How did they bridge that divide?
They came up with the Connecticut Compromise,
Right.
also known as the Great Compromise.
Okay, tell me more about this great compromise.
It created a bicameral legislature,
Right.
two houses of Congress, the House of Representatives, where representation is based on population.
Mm.
That satisfied the larger states.
Okay.
And then the Senate, where each state gets equal representation. That made the smaller states happy. It was brilliant.
It's amazing how they found that balance, that middle ground where both sides felt heard.
It speaks to their dedication to finding solutions. They were committed to building a system that could work for everyone.
And that spirit of compromise was essential, especially when they had to confront the most divisive issue of all, slavery.
Yeah, that's a tough one even today. How do you address such a morally and politically charged issue?
Must have been incredibly tense.
It was. They navigated it through a series of compromises, the most famous being the Three-Fifths Compromise.
Ah, yes, the one where enslaved people are counted as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation.
It was a deeply flawed compromise, a reflection of the power dynamics of the time.
The South wanted enslaved people counted for representation to boost their political clout.
Exactly, but they didn't want to pay taxes on them. The North argued if they're counted for representation, they should be counted for taxation too.
So 3/5 was the messy middle ground.
It was a way to avoid fully confronting the moral horror of slavery. And that avoidance had long-lasting consequences. It embedded slavery into the fabric of the nation and fueled the tensions that led to the Civil War.
A stark reminder that even groundbreaking documents can have flaws, and those flaws can reverberate for generations.
A sobering thought, isn't it?
We talked about representation in slavery. What about the presidency? How did they figure that out?
They created an entirely new branch of government from scratch. Imagine the debates.
Must have been some fireworks.
They argued about everything. How long should the president's term be? How should they be elected? What powers should they have? Should the president be elected directly by the people or chosen by Congress? It was a puzzle.
So many questions.
And of course, they found answers through more debate and compromise.
What did they land on?
A 4-year term with the possibility of re-election. They created the Electoral College, a complex system designed to balance the interests of large and small states.
And to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, they implemented checks and balances.
Exactly. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches, each with their own powers and responsibilities designed to keep each other in check.
It's incredible what they accomplished in just a few months. But the real test was yet to come. The Constitution still had to be ratified by the states.
And that process was just as challenging and contentious as the convention itself. It was a battle for the soul of the nation.
So the Constitution is drafted. Now it goes out to the states for a vote. What happens next?
Well, let's just say the debate over ratification was fierce. It divided the nation and gave birth to the first political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
It sounds like the stage is set for a showdown. What were the main arguments? Why were people so divided over this seemingly groundbreaking document?
The Federalists, folks like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, they argued that a strong central government was vital for the nation's survival.
They believed the Articles of Confederation were just too weak.
Exactly. They said a unified government was needed to address the country's problems. They saw the Constitution with its checks and balances as a protection against tyranny.
Okay, so the Federalists are pro-Constitution. What about the Anti-Federalists? What were their concerns?
They saw the Constitution as a betrayal of the American Revolution, a step towards the very tyranny they had fought to overthrow.
They must have been horrified.
Leaders like Patrick Henry and George Mason argued that the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government at the expense of states' rights and individual liberties. They feared a powerful central government would become distant and unresponsive to the people.
It was about more than just the structure of government. It was about fundamental questions of power, liberty, and the very soul of the nation.
You got it. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle for the future of America.
And that clash played out in newspapers, pamphlets, public forums across the country.
It was a war of words.
The Federalist Papers, those essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, were published to try and sway public opinion in favor of ratification.
They're brilliant pieces of writing, a compelling defense of the new system of government. They give us a glimpse into the founders' vision for the nation.
But even with all that effort, ratification was far from certain.
It was a nail-biter. The Constitution faced strong opposition, and its fate hung in the balance for months.
It all came down to a few key states.
Right. States like Virginia and New York were deeply divided. It was a political cliffhanger.
So the fate of the nation rested on the decisions of a handful of states.
And the outcome was anything but certain. Those ratification battles in Virginia and New York, they were intense.
What tipped the scales in those states?
Well, in Virginia, you had heavyweights like George Washington and James Madison. On the Federalist side, their support carried a lot of weight. But you also had Patrick Henry campaigning hard against it. It was a real clash of titans.
So star power played a role.
Yeah.
But what about specific concerns? Did anything almost derail ratification?
The lack of a Bill of Rights was a major sticking point for a lot of people. The Anti-Federalists, they argued that without explicit protections for individual liberties, the government could become tyrannical.
That's a valid concern.
Right, they worried about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, all those essential liberties.
What was the Federalist response to that?
At first, they argued that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. They said the Constitution already limited the government's powers.
So they thought it was redundant.
Kind of. They also argued that listing specific rights could actually be dangerous, implying that any right not listed could be infringed upon.
Interesting point. But in the end, they agreed to add a Bill of Rights, right?
Yes, they did. It was a strategic move to secure ratification in those key states. Several states, including Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, they ratified with the understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added as soon as the new government was up and running.
So the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, they weren't just an afterthought. They were the result of a hard-fought political battle.
Exactly, a concession by the Federalists to ensure the Constitution's success. And those amendments guaranteeing fundamental freedoms like speech, religion, the press, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches, they became cornerstones of American liberty.
It's amazing how a document born from such intense debate and compromise became so central to our national identity.
It really is. It speaks to the founders' ability to find common ground even when they disagreed vehemently. They understood that compromise was the key to creating a lasting union.
The Constitution is ratified, the nation is born. What happens next?
Well, now they had to actually make it work.
Build a government from scratch.
Right. And their first task? Elect a president.
George Washington? I mean, who else could it have been?
He was the obvious choice. The hero of the Revolution, a symbol of unity and strength.
There must have been a huge sense of relief when he took office.
Absolutely. Washington brought instant legitimacy to the new government. But he also faced monumental challenges.
Like what?
Well, for starters, there was no instruction manual. They had to figure out everything. How to structure the executive departments, create a federal court system, raise revenue, manage the national debt. It was all uncharted territory.
So Washington was setting precedents left and right.
He was, and those precedents shaped the presidency for centuries. He established the cabinet system, appointing advisors to head key departments like State Treasury War. He oversaw the creation of the federal court system, including the Supreme Court. And he established the principle of civilian control over the military, all foundational elements of American democracy.
Talk about building a legacy.
He was laying the groundwork for a functioning government, step by step.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? I imagine disagreements were inevitable.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest challenges Washington faced was the emergence of sharp divisions within his own administration.
Is this where we see the Hamilton-Jefferson rivalry come into play?
You got it. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, was a strong advocate for a powerful federal government. He wanted to centralize financial power, promote commerce and industry, build close ties with Great Britain.
And Jefferson.
Jefferson, as Secretary of State, he had a very different vision. He favored a limited federal government and agrarian economy rooted in the virtues of independent farmers. He was wary of concentrated power, whether in government or in financial institutions.
Those are some pretty fundamental differences. How do they even function as a team?
It was a constant struggle. Their disagreements weren't just about policy, they were about their core beliefs about the nature of government and the future of the nation. Their debates were heated, sometimes downright nasty.
I bet. Did Washington try to mediate between them?
He tried. He valued both men's contributions and sought a middle ground. But their differences were just too deep, their visions for the nation too divergent, and their rivalry would eventually give birth to the first political parties.
So the two-party system we know today has its roots in the Washington administration.
It does. Hamilton's supporters, mostly merchants, bankers, industrialists in the North, they formed the Federalist Party. Jefferson and Madison's followers, mainly farmers and planters in the South, they became the Democratic Republicans.
Fascinating. So political parties weren't part of the original plan. They emerged organically from those early disagreements about the direction of the nation.
Exactly. And those early parties were very different from what we have today. They were more like loose alliances of like-minded individuals, not the highly organized structures we see now. But they set the stage for the two-party system that would come to define American politics.
Okay, let's dig into some of the issues that fuel this partisan divide. Hamilton's financial program seems like a good place to start.
It's a perfect example. Hamilton's plan was bold, ambitious. It was designed to tackle the nation's financial woes and included some very controversial measures.
Like what?
The assumption of state debts by the federal government, the creation of a national bank, and tariffs to protect American industries.
Let's break that down. Starting with the assumption of state debts. Why was that so controversial?
Well, a lot of southern states had already paid off their war debts. They saw this assumption plan as a bailout for the northern states, which were still deep in debt. They thought it was unfair to be saddled with other states' debts.
I can see why they'd be upset.
It created resentment and deepened the divide between North and South. It also strengthened the power of the federal government, which was exactly what Hamilton wanted. By assuming the states' debts, he tied their financial well-being to the success of the federal government.
Smart move by Hamilton.
It was. And then there was the National Bank. That was a real lightning rod.
I can imagine.
Hamilton argued that a national bank was essential for stabilizing the economy. He said it would provide credit for businesses and help establish a stable national currency.
So a central bank, basically.
Exactly. But Jefferson and Madison, they were vehemently opposed. They saw it as a tool for the wealthy to enrich themselves at the expense of ordinary citizens. They also argued that the Constitution didn't give the government the power to create a bank.
So it was about more than just economics. It was about the balance of power and the role of government.
Exactly. And it highlighted that growing philosophical divide between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.
And then there were the tariffs. Tell me about those.
Hamilton believed that tariffs were necessary to protect American industries. He wanted to make American goods more competitive with imports, encourage domestic manufacturing, reduce reliance on foreign products.
That sounds like it would appeal to northern manufacturers and workers.
It did, but it was fiercely opposed by southern planters who relied on imported goods and feared higher prices.
So again, we see that regional divide playing out.
Yes, and Hamilton's financial program, while intended to strengthen the nation, ended up fueling those partisan tensions.
Seems like every issue they tackled just pushed the two sides further apart.
It did, and those divisions were further inflamed by disagreements over foreign policy, particularly the French Revolution.
Ah, yes, the French Revolution. That must have thrown a wrench into things.
It did. The French people's fight for liberty and equality resonated with many Americans, but it also created a dilemma for the new nation.
Because France had been America's ally during the Revolution.
Exactly. Many Americans, especially the Democratic Republicans, felt a moral obligation to support France in their fight against tyranny. But the Federalists, they were horrified by the violence and chaos of the French Revolution. They feared it would spread to America.
So two very different perspectives on the French Revolution. How did Washington handle this?
He was caught between a rock and a hard place. He had to navigate those competing pressures and decide whether to honor the alliance with France or maintain neutrality.
A tough...
It was a pivotal moment for American foreign policy. And in the end, Washington chose neutrality. In 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that the United States would not take sides in the conflict between France and Great Britain.
That must have upset a lot of people.
It did. The Democratic Republicans accused Washington of betraying the ideals of the Revolution by siding with a monarchy over a republic. The Federalists were relieved, but they still feared French influence in American politics.
And that fear led to one of the most controversial episodes in early American history, the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Ah, yes. Those laws passed in 1798 by the Federalist-controlled Congress. They targeted immigrants and critics of the government and raised serious concerns about free speech and freedom of the press.
Those acts were pretty extreme. What did they actually do?
Well, the Alien Act gave the president the power to deport any immigrant deemed dangerous to national security. The Naturalization Act made it much harder for immigrants to become citizens and vote. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the government, the president, or Congress.
That seems like a direct attack on the First Amendment.
Oh.
How did people react?
There was outrage. Many saw it as a tyrannical overreach, a betrayal of the very principles the nation was founded on. Newspapers, critical of the Federalist Party, were targeted. Prominent Democratic Republicans were arrested and imprisoned.
So the Alien and Sedition Acts, they backfired. They energized the opposition and further eroded public trust in the Federalists.
They did, and they also led to one of the most important articulations of states' rights in American history, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
Ah, yes, penned by Jefferson and Madison. These revolutions challenged the constitutionality of the Alien and Sedition Acts and asserted the right of states to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional.
Exactly. They argued that the federal government had overstepped its boundaries and that states had the right to protect their citizens from federal overreach.
It seems like the nation was on the brink. Was there any hope for unity amidst all this partisan division?
That was the question looming over the nation. The answer would lie in the outcome of the presidential election of 1800, a rematch between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
The stakes couldn't have been higher.
They weren't. This election would test the very foundations of the young American Republic. It would determine the course of its future.
The election of 1800, Adams versus Jefferson, round 2.
This was more than just a rematch. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle for the very soul of the nation.
Set the scene for us. What were the key differences between these two visions for America?
The Federalists, led by Adams, they believed in a strong centralized government. They championed commerce and industry, a powerful executive branch, and close ties with Great Britain.
And the Democratic Republicans.
They had a different vision. They wanted a more decentralized republic with a limited federal government. They emphasized agrarian values, individual liberties, closer ties with France, and they were deeply suspicious of concentrated power, whether in government or in financial institutions.
So two very different paths for the young nation.
Exactly. And the campaign was brutal, filled with personal attacks, vicious propaganda. Both sides accused the other of betraying the principles of the revolution, of threatening the future of the republic.
It's amazing how heated those early political battles could get.
It's a reminder that even in those early days, political disagreements could be incredibly intense. But amidst all that animosity, there was also a deep commitment to the democratic process.
So tell us, how did this pivotal election unfold?
Well, the results were incredibly close. In fact, it ended in a tie in the Electoral College between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr.
A tie. What happened then?
According to the Constitution, if no candidate gets a majority of electoral votes, the decision goes to the House of Representatives.
And at that time?
The House was controlled by the Federalists, Jefferson's opponents.
So Jefferson's fate was in the hands of his rivals.
It was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen.
Yeah.
The Federalists had the power to block Jefferson's presidency and choose Burr instead.
I bet that created some tension.
Oh, it did. It was a deadlock for days. Multiple ballots cast and no clear winner. Then Alexander Hamilton stepped in.
Wait, Hamilton? He was a staunch Federalist, Jefferson's arch rival. Why would he intervene?
It's a fascinating twist. Hamilton deeply disliked Jefferson personally. He disagreed with him on almost every issue, but he believed that Burr was too ambitious, too untrustworthy to be president. He saw Jefferson, despite their differences, as a man of principle and integrity.
So Hamilton put his personal feelings aside for the good of the nation.
He did. It was an act of incredible political courage, and it swayed enough Federalists to vote for Jefferson, breaking the deadlock and securing his victory.
Wow, that's a dramatic turn of events. The first peaceful transfer of power from one political party to another in a major republic. It's a testament to the strength and resilience of the American political system.
It's often called the Revolution of 1800 because it marked a fundamental shift in American politics. It showed that power could change hands peacefully, even amidst intense partisan divisions.
A peaceful revolution. Quite a legacy.
Indeed. But even though power transitioned smoothly, Jefferson's presidency wasn't without its challenges.
What were some of the biggest hurdles he faced?
He inherited a nation still grappling with the fallout from the Alien and Sedition Acts. There were ongoing tensions with European powers. The question of slavery continued to loom large. It was a time of great uncertainty and change.
So Jefferson, the champion of limited government, he ended up expanding federal power with the Louisiana Purchase.
He did. And he took actions like the Embargo Act that some saw as infringing on economic freedoms. It's a reminder that governing often requires compromises that might contradict one's ideals.
Governing is rarely easy or straightforward.
Exactly. It's about making tough choices, balancing competing interests, navigating complex situations. It often demands pragmatism and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. And as we've seen throughout this deep dive, the early republic was a period of constant adaptation, a time when the very meaning of America was being debated and defined.
From the Articles of Confederation of the Constitution, the ratification debates, the birth of political parties, the rise of partisan conflict, it's been quite a journey.
It has, and it's a journey that continues to shape us today. The challenges they faced, the compromises they made, the precedents they set, they all resonate in our modern political landscape.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the origins of the United States. We've explored the triumphs and the failures, the hopes and the fears of those who built this nation.
It's a story full of drama, intrigue, and inspiration. A reminder that the American experiment is an ongoing process, a work in progress, and it's up to each generation to safeguard the legacy of those who came before us and to continue striving for a more perfect union.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of the United States. So we hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history.